And welcome to Hudson. My name is Matt Boyce. I'm a senior fellow here, and I have a special pleasure of welcoming this great delegation here from Bulgaria and UK slash Finland. We have Ruslan Stevanov, Martin Vladimirov, and Isaac Levy, two representatives from the Center for the Study of Democracy in Sofia, and one from the Center for Research on Environment and Energy and Clean Air in Helsinki. You all were here in September last year when you presented the results, the very interesting results of your study on democratic resilience, economic security, and sanctions enforcement in Europe, which, among other things, pointed out how Russia's been able to finance its, to keep large amounts of revenue flowing to finance its war against Ukraine. Your study enjoyed some success. It took a while, as things in the EU often do, but last week we saw the Commission launching a strategy which, if implemented, would end gas imports from Russia by 2027, and thus stopping its funding for, or reducing its funding substantially for its defense industry. And of course, the Czech Republic in January cut off Russian gas and oil last month. So while the EU strategy is not a done deal, but the Commission is going in the right direction and has signaled no turning back. So the Czech results and the EU results, I will say, are clear, and again, congratulations. In the meantime, you've been drilling down on the issue of how to increase economic security in Europe and what the EU can do better of or differently to reduce funding to the Kremlin war machine. Politico Europe this morning featured your study, this one that just came out today, The Last Mile, Phasing Out Russian Oil and Gas in Central Europe. And then also today was published the Kremlin playbook in Turkey, Geoeconomics Unfolded. These are so timed for your visit in Washington. The Kremlin playbook actually is, I think, what, the 6th in your series of Kremlin playbooks. It started in 2016. Very, very interesting. I would encourage people to look at them. They may have made a big, had a lot of influence, made a big splash beginning in 2016, and with each additional publication. So the latest is out today as well. So anyway, for our guests here today and our online audience, this is the CSD and CREA are basically our think tanks to watch, producing really good stuff. We're really excited to have you back to present the results of your latest path-breaking studies. And finally, a special welcome to Austrian Ambassador Schneebauer, as well as a multi-partisan group of Austrian MPs and MEPs who have joined us from Vienna. So you all know what's in store for us today. Our visitors will discuss practical steps that Europe can take to end its reliance on Russian oil and gas and better use sanctions enforcement tools to modernize its institutions. So now, without further ado, Ruslan will lead us off with a short statement, and then we'll turn to Isaac and Martin, who will then speak for about 10 minutes and draw from their slides, which we have in the back here. And then we'll move into a discussion, and then, of course, followed by questions and answers. So please have your questions and comments ready. So, Ruslan, welcome again, and set the stage for us, or set the table for us.
Thanks for having us, Matt, and really thank you to Hudson for this warm welcome. And this is our, I think, 4th or 5th consecutive meeting here on the topic of economic security. And we think this is of paramount importance, in particular with the talks going on in Turkey right now. Clearly, there is a need for us to keep closing these last loopholes. You know, I don't think that we could allow ourselves as the West, the US, Europe, to continue allowing China and Russia to benefit from our technology, our energy, our markets, as they continue waging this war in Ukraine on a daily basis. And I think my colleagues are going to provide, as you mentioned, really we managed together with Hudson, together with our partners in Europe, we managed to close 2 of these loopholes, in the Czech Republic last time, and we are hoping that these 2 last holdouts, Hungary and Slovakia, who do have the alternatives, we have been reading there, and I think the EU is moving a little bit slower, but we still think there are opportunities to happen. We've gone a long way to be there, but also we need to stay vigilant, and that's what our Kremlin playbook in Turkey is showing. That Russia has been able to build the capacity and the local networks to essentially deny business and opportunities, for example, the US LNG getting into Europe. And that's, I think, something that we need to continue working on. And I think we're here to both work with Hudson, work with our partners, to continue building up Europe's capacity to enforce sanctions. Because so far, and I think it's still valid, that Europe cannot enforce sanctions credibly without the US's backing. But we think we can be there if we, for example, continue as we do, strengthen our sanctions enforcement capacity with the European Public Prosecutor's Office, with Olaf and so on and so forth. But for the time being, we still need a little bit more time. Or as I would say, I'll quote General Keith Kellogg, I think it's time to ramp up the sanctions or the credibility of sanctions enforcement on Russia from 3 out of 10 to at least 5 out of 10, which would mean finally closing these last loopholes on oil and, of course, gas through Turkstream. Thank you, and it's always a pleasure, and I look forward for the discussion.
So when you say 3 to 10 to 5, you mean on a scale of 1 to 10? We're at 3.
We're at 3 right now. Well, this is at least. Well, I agree with General Kellogg that we're at 3 out of 10. Yeah. We could certainly go much higher so that we could pressure Russia into peace a little bit more. Clearly, they've been given so much opportunities to do that, and they've been dragging their feet. I think it's time that we test a little bit of a different strategy here.
Yeah, so I think it's quite clear that there's little or no interest on the part of Putin to engage in a serious.
And I certainly we see at least in Europe there is a resolve to do that. So I think it's a good time to follow up on that.
Good. So shall we start off with you, Isaac?
Sure.
And then you'll draw on your slides.
Yeah, that sounds great.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for having us here at the Hudson Institute and for all your attendance. It's great to see so many faces and so much interest in our analysis. Thanks also for CSD for facilitating these publications as well. So next slide, please. I work at the Center for Research. We also provide policy recommendations on improving the sanctions on Russia. So our analysis is on energy diversification, sanctions enforcement, and improving their impact as well. So we're a small dynamic team that aim to provide analysis ahead of the curve, being one of the first organizations to be reporting on the refining loophole, which we'll be touching on today. Next slide. So the chart on the right-hand side is a live tracker of all of Russia's fossil fuel export earnings, like we mentioned, by type. And as you can see, Russia's export revenues are relatively resilient. They're incredibly reliant on export revenues of fossil fuels to finance the war in Ukraine. About a third of all their budget revenue came from oil and gas exports, totaling $116 billion US dollars last year. And this is about over 80% of their military spending last year as well. So sanctions have had an effect at reducing Russia's export revenues, but that impact has been diminishing over time due to two main factors. One of them is sanctions evasion techniques have advanced without being punished. And secondly, those loopholes in sanctions that we're going to focus on today have persisted. So as you can see in the table on the bottom right of the slide, export revenues are a mere 5% in the most recent year of 2024, below the revenues pre-invasion. So they've held up relatively resiliently. Next slide, please. So the colorful chart on the right-hand side shows 6 refineries, that's all it is in the world, which CREA have identified as buying Russian crude oil, refining it into gasoline, diesel, and other oil products, and selling that back to sanctioning countries. So this is what we mentioned is a legal loophole, the refining loophole in the sanctions. So the US, as you know, banned the import of Russian oil in April 2022. However, this loophole enables an increasing quantity of oil products made from Russian crude to flow into the US. From 2024 until the first quarter of 2025, these 6 refineries in India and Turkey sold $9.3 billion worth of oil products made from Russian crude to those sanctioning countries. And this enabled $5 billion of Kremlin tax revenues used to finance the war in Ukraine. So this is why it's so important. And the USA was the 3rd largest import country in the world of this oil. So it's very important that it's banned. And it's a 28% increase in the most recent year on pre-invasion levels. So without this being banned, importers will continue to buy oil products from those refineries relying on Russian crude. So there's one specific refinery I wanted to hone in on. Next slide, please. The Vadinar refinery in India, which is part owned by the sanctioned Russian oil giant Rosneft. So it doubly benefits through the import of Russian crude, sending finances back to the Kremlin, but also the profit margin it makes on the oil products that it sells to those sanctioning countries. So it wouldn't be inflationary for the US to ban imports from these refineries, or specifically of the Vadinar refinery, which makes up just 0.25% of total imports, but would cut off hundreds of millions of US dollars flowing back to the Kremlin in tax revenues. Next slide, please. LNG. So as you probably have read, the EU has increased its imports of Russian LNG in the most recent year. Russia is incredibly reliant on the EU market to sell its LNG, with over half of Russia's exports of LNG going to the EU and earning $8.5 billion last year. We've seen increases mostly in France, but as we know, France is buying a lot of the Russian LNG that gets regasified and sent onwards to other neighboring countries such as Germany. Next slide, please. So Russia has plans to increase its LNG export capacity. And this chart on the right-hand side shows those current projects, the sanctioned projects such as Arctic LNG 2, which has been incredibly successful, the US sanctioning of that installation, prohibiting its exports, as well as those planned new operations in Murmansk. So Russia aims to diversify its export portfolio, expand its projects, and drill more in the Arctic, of course. So lifting US sanctions would be lifting the US sanctions of Russian LNG installations would enable more Russian gas to flow into Europe and be a direct competition for US LNG exporters. Next slide, please. So this is showing the main different installations of Russian LNG exports, with the largest one being Yamal. The Yamal installation in the small chart shows that most of this gas is basically geared towards going to Europe, because it can only pass through the Arctic Ocean in the summer months. So it's very much reliant on the EU market. Next slide, please. The EU has struggled to attain sufficient non-Russian gas supply. So in the most recent year, the 3rd year of Russia's full-scale invasion, their imports of non-Russian gas went up just 10%. They weren't able to replace pipeline gas, so those levels have remained very stable from non-Russian pipeline suppliers. And actually, Russian LNG has increased as they've managed to try and reroute some of this gas that used to come via the Nord Stream pipeline. So that's on the right-hand side, the chart in red, showing an increase of 12% of Russian LNG exports to the EU. Meanwhile, US LNG exports actually fell by 17% in 2024 compared to the prior year. We have seen, however, and that's the blue section of the chart, a rise in the most recent 2 months of US LNG exports to the EU. This is a screenshot, next slide, of our report that's come out today, covered by Politico, showing how Hungary and Slovakia have undermined the EU sanctions by increasing their imports of Russian oil and gas. Next slide, please. So Hungary has increased its reliance on Russian oil from 61% in 2021, pre-invasion, to over 86% in the most recent year of 2024. And they were provided a carve-out in the EU sanctions to give them more time to reduce their reliance, but actually they've done the opposite, sending huge profit back to Russian oil suppliers and benefiting the company MOL, which have a contract expiring in June 2025 with Lukoil, which is an oil giant sanctioned by the US currently. So the claims made by by the two refineries in Slovakia and Hungary that they can't process non-Russian crude have been disproven in our report, showing that they have done so previously and they have the technical capabilities to do so. And they also have sufficient supply through the Adria pipeline to access non-Russian crude oil that could cover the whole two countries' needs. Next slide. So before I pass on to Martin, I just wanted to highlight a few things. That, the EU must not go back to Russian gas. And this is noted by Ursula von der Leyen's recent statements. A reminder that in the summer of 2022, in the energy crisis, the EU forked out almost $900 billion to the consumer subsidies. This is showing the volatility of reliance on Russian gas. What's going to happen this year, it's uncertain. The EU transshipment ban could actually mean that more Russian LNG stays within Europe rather than being re-exported onto suppliers in Asia.
We actually see it already.
Yeah, exactly. Rising Russian LNG imports into the EU. If the US remain and keep their sanctions on smaller installations of Portovaya and Vysotsk, this could actually lower Russian LNG exports to the EU as they've been unable to operate after being sanctioned. And then finally, the US must avoid participation in Nord Stream 2 and Ukrainian gas transit. So this could enable 70 billion cubic meters of Russian gas to flow back into Europe again. And that's the exact quantity that the US is likely to export to the EU this year in 2025. So it would be a direct competition. Some EU firms have recently secured deals with US LNG projects such as Cefe, Delphin, Total Energies, and and buying from Next Decade. And then Chinese imports of US LNG could be redirected to the EU as they face higher tariffs. So this poses an opportunity to help the EU reduce reliance on Russia. Thank you. I'm going to pass to Martin.
Thanks so much, Isaac. CREA's work is a great inspiration for CSD. In the past 3 years, we had a great collaboration. And CREA has been really spot on from the very start of the invasion of exposing these glaring loopholes and also exposing how much money the Kremlin is making from selling fossil fuels. Thank you so much, Matt, for hosting us once again. And this is a good, very timely discussion, also considering the talks in Anchor and elsewhere. I mean, the devil is in the details, and these details could be some of the key issues to be discussed during the peace negotiations in Ukraine. Because a lot of the leverage that the Kremlin has is this continued flows of oil and gas towards the world. But now, slide, please. Now, switching to another vulnerability we have been monitoring since the start of the invasion, Turkey. It's easier for me to pronounce it the old way, sorry for that. So we have been seeing how Russian influence has been surging in the country over the past decade. So we decided last year to do something more structured and really assess what are the different mechanisms the Kremlin has been using to expand its footprint and try to change the foreign and strategic policy of one of our most important transatlantic allies, Turkey. And so we just published today the Kremlin Playbook in Turkey. I want to thank Molly Rickles, who is in the room, who is co-author and analyst from CSD's Geoeconomics program, for working on all of these details and data regarding different sector exposure. So, slide please. So in 2010, if you remember, there is a famous diplomatic cable that was leaked from the Ankara station, which was titled "Who Lost Turkey?" And it was a US kind of alarm-raising document saying that Turkey might be going in the wrong direction in terms of its commitment to the transatlantic alliance. And over the years, this question has reappeared on a number of occasions, but I don't think the Western community has taken some measures to bring Turkey or to preserve Turkey as a reliant partner as much as we would like to. And even though Turkey and Russia were on the verge of a military conflict in 2015, since then things have gone the other way around. Turkey is now buying a lot of Russian arms, including anti-aircraft missiles. And since the Russian invasion of Ukraine, as you can see from these graphs, the exposure, the dependence of Turkey on Russian trade has skyrocketed. Basically, right now, close to 14% of the imports of Turkey come from Russia. Most of it is oil, gas, coal, fertilizers, steel, commodities that are key inputs and ingredients of the enormous Turkish manufacturing base. So one kind of point of view to this trend has been that Turkey is just benefiting from cheaper goods, cheaper Russian commodities. But most of the trading has been done actually by Kremlin-linked companies. So the benefits for the final consumers in Turkey are very low. Most of the profit remains in the hands of these Russian-linked companies. And some of the role that Turkey has played is to preserve the Kremlin's share, kind of Kremlin's position on global trade and financial markets. Next slide, please. This is especially true in two main areas. One is Turkey as an enabler of Russian fossil fuel flows back to the West, mostly the EU, but also the US. And the other role has been Turkey as a conduit for the re-export of dual-use goods used in the military war, the military effort that the Kremlin has been waging in Ukraine. You can see on this graph the enormous expansion of the exports of dual-use goods to Russia from Turkey. We have done a very detailed statistical analysis. This is a direct correspondence to an increase in imports from the US and the EU of similar military-grade goods. Next slide, please. And of course, on the oil topic, I'm not going to delve too much on it because Isaac already mentioned the big picture. But Turkey has been one of the countries that we haven't talked too much about. There's so much focus on China, and Russia's-Chinese relationship, of course, is very big. But let's not forget that Turkey has become the single biggest importer of Russian oil products in the world. We are talking about 35 billion euros or $37 billion worth of oil products. And Turkey doesn't need all of these products. Many of these fuels are then re-exported to Europe, re-exported to the US. And the profit margin stays within sanctioned companies like Lukoil, like Tatneft, like Rosneft, and then directly feed into these networks of influence that Russia has all across Europe and of course, Turkey. Next slide, please. In some cases, because there is a refining loophole, so I mean, there are many people in Europe that are telling you, oh, yes, it's a loophole, but it's legal, so what can we do? Well, we try to dig deeper into the issue, especially with the help of some of the satellite imaging that also CREA has access to. So we were looking at the direct relaundering, basically, of oil products. Some of the ports that are receiving Russian fuels do not have access to alternative source of supply, a refinery, a pipeline, etc. So what we have been seeing on a massive scale is that certain traders are buying oil products and re-exporting those from Turkey directly to the EU. And we have seen that the data confirms that even if we don't have documentary evidence, some of our work has actually sparked investigations on EU level with EU authorities for potential sanctions violations related to Turkey. Next slide, please. And now moving to gas, but because I think this is a low-hanging fruit, as also Isaac mentioned, we can phase out Russian gas right now. It doesn't need any major shifts in global gas markets for this to happen. There are very little security supply concerns related to this. So we're dragging our feet, let's be clear about it. And probably the most obvious case of that has been Turk Stream. Turk Stream is the southern route of Russian gas supply to Europe. It's actually the single largest Russian supply source right now to Europe. And it has contributed 25 billion euros over the last 3 years to the Kremlin budget. Paradox here with the Turk Stream is that flows like the LNG flows not only are rising, they're expanding beyond the capacity that the pipeline has. So they're doing magic, you know. Authorities in all countries that are transiting Russian gas have been tweaking, you know, technically compressor stations so that they can move as much Russian gas as possible. And guess what? Now they want to double the capacity of this pipeline. And this is brand new in a way. Turkey has been signaling that they want to be a major Russian gas hub. They announced it publicly. They got the exemption from US sanctions on Gazprom Bank so that they can work more with Russia. And now all the authorities along the Turk Stream route are working the details, the technical and commercial details, so that all the Ukrainian gas transits, so the Russian gas transit through Ukraine, can be rerouted through Turkey as a Turkish blend. Next slide, please. And I would like to end on a positive note. It's not, you know, Turk Stream and oil products re-exports would probably stop if there is incentive provided on the other side. What we have found in the case of one port, just by a threat for secondary sanctions from the US, this port has immediately stopped buying Russian oil products. You know, we shouldn't underestimate secondary sanctions. As President Trump mentioned the other day, this is probably the most effective way to bring back Russia to the table. Because I don't think some of these traders, which are small companies, if we compare to the giants, they are going to risk being switched off from the US global financial system, even if they're just threatened with a credible threat. And on the gas side, in Europe, we need to finish our homework. This roadmap is a great step forward. Thank you, Matt, for pointing it out. But there is no real instrument for enforcement. And this is the big problem with sanctions in general for the strategic decoupling from Russia. You need enforcement. You need to create a mechanism whereas these member states and these companies would suffer the consequences from not doing their job properly. One way to do it, in our opinion, is to create a tax incentive for traders to buy US LNG instead of Russian LNG or Russian pipeline gas. So right now, Russian gas is undercutting the competition. Basically, Gazprom is dumping all of its surplus gas on the European market. And so, of course, traders have an incentive to buy more Russian gas. So our suggestion, which does not require unanimity in the EU Council, and that's very important, is to impose a customs duty, so basically a surplus tax on the imports of Russian gas, which equalizes the price of the Russian gas with the average price in Europe, meaning that traders would then have no benefit of buying more Russian gas. So this can fly, I think. It requires a tweak in the customs union regulation, but most of all, it requires political will. And political will comes from the stronger work between US and EU authorities on sanctions enforcement and bringing these countries and these companies to the table. Thank you so much.
Yeah, this crunching the numbers that you've done, Isaac and Martin, is extremely helpful because this is a very complicated market, and we really need these data to show exactly what's happening in the market. You said so much. There's a lot to unpack here. There's the U.S. angle, Isaac, which I thought was very interesting. Maybe we could go into that in the Q&A. But there's and of course the secondary sanctions thing, the issue that President Trump has been sort of mentioning every so often is that sort of data point, Martin, that you is very interesting. But maybe just opening the aperture a little bit, Isaac, we've been seeing a lot of sanctions placed on the shadow fleet, and this is actually this is also part of this picture. Have you been tracking any of the results of all these? Because both the EU has and the US has. There are hundreds now of ships that are vessels that are sanctioned. Not all of them, but a rather large percentage of them now. Do we have any initial results on how that's working? Because if it takes just a threat by a social a social media post to stop something in Turkey, is there anything happening on the shadow fleet that we should know about?
Yeah.
As you go into because you've been really crunching the numbers here and going into enormous detail.
Thanks for that. So yeah, CREA is tracking basically all the tankers transporting Russian oil. And to give a little bit of context, the oil price cap policy used the fact that Russia was reliant on about 90% of its oil to be transported on Western-owned or insured tankers. So that's when the oil price cap came into force in December 2022, stating if Russia wanted to sell its oil on these Western-owned or insured tankers, it had to pay below a certain price. So Russia was faced with two options to try and circumvent the policy. Either it starts developing the shadow fleet, which is no connection to Western-owned or insured tankers, so buying up tankers and not using Western insurance, which it's done quite slowly, but it has successfully increased the size of its shadow fleet, all to continue transporting Russian oil on Western-owned or insured tankers and lying about the price paid. So those two techniques have been used. To counter this, the US, OFAC, have been relatively successful at sanctioning some of the 600 vessels that we estimate as being the Russian shadow fleet. So I think it's around 200 that the US have sanctioned now. And it's made it difficult for Russia because they've basically spent an estimate of around $14 billion developing the shadow fleet, buying these tankers. And once they've been sanctioned by OFAC, it's been relatively effective at prohibiting their ability to continue transporting Russian oil. So it has been an effective measure. We would very much encourage the US to increase the sanctions on shadow tankers and stop their ability to continue operations. But as expected, Russia will find a way around it. It's transporting more Russian oil on Greek-owned tankers now, and still violating the price cap. So it is a measure that's been a hindrance for Russia, but the flows continue to finance the invasion. Please come in.
Contradict just a little bit, if I may. The sanctions, the shadow fleet is a joke. Sorry, I'm very, direct, cynical here because I'm getting mad out of this. Shadow fleet is, it's no longer important for Russia. The oil price is below the $60 cap. So both you and I have been arguing that we need the oil price cap to go down much lower if this makes sense. Now they're just going, as you said, to Greek shippers and Western insurers. So there's no problem with actually selling oil right now.
Yeah, it's a very good point. Thanks for coming in. So I think the US could do very many other measures that could be more effective. We talk about secondary sanctions and banning the refining loophole, which enables billions of dollars to flow back to the Kremlin and Russian oil to be filling cars in the US as well. So I think there are other measures they could do, and yeah, increasing enforcement of the oil price cap, or actually banning the provision of maritime insurance and Western-owned vessels to continue facilitating Russia to transport its oil would be more effective. I agree with Martin on that.
So you're saying essentially you can sanction the entire shadow fleet, and it wouldn't. The Russians will find a way around it, either through Greeks or the Greek fleet or other. Is that what we can conclude from that?
Well, Matt, if it's the history of sanctions, they can't, the global economy is a very resilient animal, in particular when you have a large economy supported by China, that wants to get away with it. First of all, they were half-hearted measures, the oil tanker sanctions. A big chunk of the shadow fleet were actually taken out, but also it's the expectation of where this is going. That's why I mentioned this scale of 3 to 10. We're 3 to 10. And the fact that Russia and China are interpreting President Trump's proposal for peace as okay, maybe we're going to let go of that, is problematic, because immediately along all these sanctions enforcement are weakened all across the board. So we need to keep that pressure going until we see steps on the ground. And secondly, we've been discussing this with colleagues. I think for Europe, it would be ludicrous to think about going back to the Russian markets or allowing Russia on the European markets, given the way they have lied to decades of German and European policy of relying on Russian energy. I think that's why we have to be very clear, and I hope that the signals we're seeing out of Brussels are showing that we need to decouple, no matter what the US policy on that is. That should be very clear on the European side. On the US side, I think it's, again, when we talk about sanctions, it's clearly that the Russians and the Chinese have been very strategic in our region. So while the Russians have been keeping or kind of through Turk Stream or through their oil supply, they've kept out different projects, like, for example, the EastMed. We're talking about, again, the EastMed. But it's not going to happen as long as these networks that Martin and very well details, the whole team very well details in the Kremlin playbook in Turkey, exist there. So we need to be very clear about it, So it's and I don't think that this is going to also have. There's need to be a very clear policy also vis-a-vis China. Until they're not playing by the rules, we need to be clear about scaling up this sanctions pressure.
Speaking of China, Martin, anything sort of? They're also a player here. I mean, this is not just Russia. Or India or Turkey. But can you talk a bit more about how China fits into this picture, either in Central Europe or just even more broadly?
Well, China has been always there for Russia, and not only for Russia. I would say I want to put up my Venezuelan hat for a second, because we have been just researching this. And this is very much related to also what Russia has been doing, and what can be done to stop that. I mean, China has been enabling a network of traders, shippers, to help countries that are under US sanctions evade those. Venezuela right now sells huge amounts of oil to China, or like a big chunk of its oil to China, thanks to Malaysian registered shippers. China is helping in a similar way to Russia, and to Iran as well. There's specific refineries that are tasked to refine only Iranian crude oil, for example. So without China, as Ruslan also mentioned, it will be very hard to really have a chokehold on this Russian fossil fuel revenue. So the idea of changing the behavior of China and also India, I would say, is critical here. And what we have seen, however, is that the appetite for that has been over the last decade very, very small. And I say last decade because this is not a new phenomenon. And Chinese influence across the world is rising, we know that, but it's even rising closest to home. And I wanted to point out that in the EU, we have seen a massive increase in Chinese investment, trade, ties. Now, most of the investment that comes into the EU is actually going to the same region that we are talking about, Turkey, Southeast Europe, Central Europe. That's where China has found a kind of a window of opportunity to penetrate infrastructure, energy, telecommunications, etc. And this is a vulnerability. So whatever happens with the peace talks in Ukraine, we need to rethink our trade ties, our investment ties, both with Russia and China. Strategic decoupling with Russia, with China, some kind of a more practical approach, maybe decoupling might not work out. But really, China has turned the scales, trade scales on us, especially in Europe. And so there needs to be a mechanisms to try to fend off some of this, economic footprint, because it is trying to undermine the competitiveness of local economies and local businesses. So one of our measures that we have been proposing from 2016, from the very first Kremlin playbook, has been, if you want to tackle economic footprint, economic influence, you can only do it long-term sustainably with footprint. So, if Chinese or Russian footprint pulls out of these countries, how are you going to fill the gap? You need a strategy to bring investment from the West. So initiatives like the Free Seas Initiative, for example, would be key. Bring investment in strategic sectors that are difficult to make sense commercially, that are not very commercially viable, but are key for creating a new kind of trading and investment infrastructure.
Ruslan, did you hear?
Yeah, just wanted to give an example. You remember the great 3 Cs initiatives of the first Trump administration? This has also been the EU's idea about the south-north corridor. We don't have it yet, but the Russians and the Chinese do. The Russians have the energy north-south, through Turk Stream, and the Chinese have the rail and road through Greece up to Central Europe. And the EU and the US don't have that. In this fault line region that abuts Ukraine, it's clearly we're feeling the geoeconomics and geopolitical pressure. This is not been happening. So we need not just private market investments, but also a very strategic government agreement to strengthen this. But again, as Martin said, without ramping up this sanction pressure, because these people are there because of strategic corruption in most of these cases. It's not because they've been more markedly competitive. And the fact that they're already there means that if we leave it only to the market participants whom they're already paying, they're on the ground, this is not happening.
Maybe I could just go back to you, Isaac. So you mentioned this whole question of what happens if, let's say, Nord Stream 2 were to be reopened, or what the effects this would have on U.S. exports, for example. So there has been some talk about this. Whether it's how real is it, of course, a very different question. But I mean, and there is interest in parts of Europe of resuming this relationship. But I mean, after the guns fall silent and there was some sort of a durable peace, but I mean, that would, of course, counteract some of the good things you say that would happen. For example, it would fund the Russian military again, or continue that flow. It would, of course, reduce U.S. exports, as well as reduce the benefits that LNG might play in the trade balance, which is what the administration is so concerned about, is rectifying those trade imbalances. Can you talk a little bit more about that aspect? Sort of how real is this, and or is this all just sort of idle talk?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. It's been reported a lot in the media. There's lots of talk about US companies getting involved to facilitate Russian flows of gas back to Europe again, restarting flows through Nord Stream 2, 55, I believe, billion cubic meters, like we mentioned, is similar quantities of US LNG they sell to Europe. So it's going to act as a direct competition. So it's definitely something that the US should prohibit. We've seen how effective some US sanctions can be. I like to use example Arctic LNG 2. This is a huge gas installation that was supposed to come online, I believe, just over a year ago. And I think it's between 6 and 8 different LNG carriers have picked up LNG from this installation, and they've not been able to find buyers. So it's basically prohibited around $8 billion worth of LNG to be exported out of Russia. So this is a real case where the US can sanction Russian gas entities and prohibit their export earnings, which actually protects US gas interests. I mean, like we mentioned, the last 2 months, I believe, have been the highest 2 months of US LNG exports to the EU. So if US gas interests are being protected and increasing flows to Europe, they have to stop Russian flows going back to Europe, which is in the Europeans' interest as well. We've seen the volatility and energy blackmail used by Putin from those countries or member states that rely heavily on Russian gas.
And can I also just, before we go into the discussions portion, can I just ask you to talk a little bit more about the U.S. angle here? Because I think probably not everybody is aware of how much Russian, whatever gasoline that is Russian molecules actually are fueling cars here, for example. Can you talk a little bit more about that, sort of in more granular terms? Because I think that would actually be that's probably not very well known.
This is about the oil products from Russia. So
that are turning up here. These are fungible products. It's a world market. I mean, so it's not surprising that some of it ends up here.
This is the idea of any loophole in sanctions. If it's not banned, companies will just act in their best interest to increase their profits. So that's why we mentioned there's been a 30% increase in the US imports of oil products from those refineries running partially on Russian crude. So like we mentioned, there's 3 refineries in Turkey and 3 refineries in India, huge complexes. One of them is the biggest refinery in the whole world, Jamnagar refinery, that buy billions of dollars worth of Russian crude oil, turning it into gasoline that then gets exported to the US and Europe as well at increasing quantities. So I believe the statistics are around $5 billion US dollars worth of Russian crude that's used to make those gasoline products that go to the US from Turkey and India. And then last stat, I guess, is I think it was the report we put out on Turkey, that the amount of oil products that they were buying would fuel the whole consumption of vehicles in Florida. That's made from Russian crude. So it is relatively large quantities, but they're not sold at a discount. So the US banning them wouldn't be inflationary and could cut a lot of money going back to the Kremlin.
Mm-hmm. Something to think about, a lot to think about, but sort of we never seem to have enough time for Q's and A's. So maybe we should just end here, unless you have any sort of parting remarks, final remarks. We can just move over to the discussion portion, because we never seem to have enough time for questions from our participants. Shall we? All right, good. So in the remaining time, if anybody has any questions or comments for our distinguished guests, here's your chance. Sir.
Hi, John Kay from the Celis Institute, longtime CSD admirer. I think you've mapped out in really a comprehensive way a lot of the loopholes and that are existing within the EU. My question to you all is for Fico and Orban in particular, what pressure points do you think exist to close those loopholes for Slovakia and Hungary in particular?
First of all, don't give Hungary 500 million euros for supposedly upgrading their refinery, because supposedly this refinery cannot operate on non-Russian crude oil, which is just not true. Because this is a kind of a delay and obfuscate strategy. The idea is you present a technical obstacle so that you gain more time. If you gain that time, MOL would sign a new long-term contract for delivery of crude oil from Lukoil, which expires at the end of June, which would then immediately create a new obstacle for a phase-out. Once 2027 comes, Hungary will say, oh, we have a long-term contract, what can we do? So don't give them goodies when they don't really deserve those goodies, hoping that this will change the calculus. I don't think this is happening really at the moment. And the second point, I think, is go after the strategic corruption networks who are benefiting actually, who are taking the profit, not Hungarian consumers, not Slovak consumers, God forbid, not U.S. Suppliers of oil and gas to Europe. It is really 5-6 people we're talking about. We have maps on them, 5-6 companies, and they're all shell companies in Cyprus and the BVI, and so go after these entities and go after these people specifically, and the whole house of cards might fall down.
Can I just further on that? So this whole technical argument which you've been hearing about for years, that could you maybe go into that a little bit more? So there have been cases where these refineries have refined other oil, and so the argument is now clearly debunked.
First of all, and this is the most ironic thing, the head of MOL said it on paper in the press. He said, we can refine non-Russian crude oil, no problem.
Of course, it's chemistry.
And in 2019, there was a major outage of the Druzhba pipeline delivering Russian oil. So Hungary and Slovakia immediately changed to buying only non-Russian crude oil, because there is a huge pipeline which is effectively empty, which connects the Adriatic coast of the Mediterranean to Central Europe with enough capacity to supply all the region. But the problem there is that, sorry for the details, it's just the Hungarian company bought the Croatian kind of oil sector, but in a murky way. So there was a sentencing for corruption of MOL's individuals. So now MOL doesn't want to buy anything from Croatia on political grounds, more or less. That's their excuse, but this is just an excuse.
And we heard the same argument also with Russian uranium. In other words, that Soviet/Russian nuclear power plants could only use Russian uranium, which of course is, or nuclear fuel, which turns out to of course not be true. But this argument was being used for this sort of technical argument was being used for many years, and most people didn't know enough about it to know the difference, and so they accepted it.
Yeah. I'll say that publicly, because why not? I went to Brussels last November, and I spoke to the External Action Service about it. And they said, oh, the Hungarian government came to us and told us, we can't do it. Technically, it's impossible. And I told them it's not true, and provided data. Well, how can we say no to the Hungarian government if they say it's technically not true? Can we compromise the security supply of a member state? And told them, yes, compromise it for a month, and you'll see how they'll adapt very quickly. The example of Bulgaria, sorry. We have been facing this argument for years in Bulgaria. And guess what?
Precisely since 1998.
Yeah. And then in November 2023, we published our assessment showing that there is no problem of actually refining 24 different blends of crude oil. There is a lot of pressure. The government decides to end the exemption on buying Russian oil prematurely in 3 weeks. In 3 weeks. And then no Russian oil since then. So it's possible.
And no price spikes.
Yeah.
No price spikes. By the way, the price has never been lower in Bulgaria, I must say.
That's an important point, Matt.
Yeah.
The thing is the profit. Well, let me go back a little bit, because we're among allies here, right? And I would say it's important to say in the very expressive language of President Trump, Hungary and Slovakia have been ripping off the whole alliance, the EU and the US, big time, because they've been given hundreds of millions, billions to adapt. The EU has all these, has the package to, upgrade their refineries. They've made hundreds of millions more in profits. And the thing is, the profit doesn't go to the Hungarian and Slovak consumers. They don't go to the European consumers. They actually they stay in the Russian and the Hungarian Slovak companies that have been or have had Russian interests in them. And this is particularly important. We certainly, and the EU has had, we've had every 6 months we have the rolling over of sanctions, and we've had these discussions all the time. Clearly, Prime Minister Orban has been very smart in investing his relationship with President Trump. but strategically, they've been in the way of this EU and US initiative to actually pressure Russia. So I think this is important that we make this distinction. We're the most advanced technological power in the world. By we, I mean the Western Alliance. And we have provided so much funding, and we're saying that there is a technical problem we cannot solve in an issue that is, is very clear. That's not true. Actually, there is a lot of, and we have to be clear about the Russian interests in this. The same as in Nord Stream and South Stream and Turk Stream. These are not commercial projects, as we Europeans have very clearly realized. These have been strategic projects that have engaged us.
Right, well,
if I can just briefly add, on the prices at the pump, I do think it's quite interesting because our report that's come out today shows that Hungarian gasoline prices pre-tax are 5% higher than other EU countries, whilst the oil giant, the Hungarian oil giant MOL, their operating income is 30% above pre-invasion. So they've basically benefited from increasing the country's reliance on Russian crude. I mean, the Russian crude goes through Ukraine, so there's huge volatility. We've seen 2 outages last year, so it's very unstable. It puts the country at huge energy security risks, profits MOL, whilst the customers are paying above average EU prices. Sorry.
No, it does really point to the arbitrage there, or the amount of the sort of the profits that can accrue to those who refine, given the low prices from Russia and the global market. So we have time for a bit more. I mean, we can go over if people don't want to leave. Olga.
Thank you so much. Olga Hakova, Atlantic Council. I run our European energy security work. Really appreciate the presentation and congratulations on the launch. Very exciting report. I wanted to follow through on the previous question and what you've just discussed. I think it's important to know that Slovakia and Hungary have been most outspoken about in terms of how hard it is to diversify. But I think a lot of us in this room know that a lot of other countries across Europe would be very excited to see additional flows, especially on the industry side. In some countries, there's actually a huge disconnect between political will and political messaging and political discipline in terms of saying, no, we want to diversify. There's a gap between what the industry wants and what the industry is open to consider. So I think it's really important to kind of assess that reality, that there's actually a lot of appetite outside of those 2 countries to see more Russian flows. My question to you is, have you done analysis on the exact, and I know there's different scenarios, but the exact additional cost, because there's this narrative that it's so much more expensive to say, let's just do a scenario where there's no more Russian gas in by 2027, something that EU is looking into. We'll see how serious the legislative proposal will come out this June, right, in the end of June. So let's say there is, a very strict, there's teeth to it. There's a legislative proposal that say no more natural gas going into, no more LNG, no more pipe gas by 2027. Have you done an analysis on how that will impact an average consumer across Europe in terms of their costs? Because there's this narrative that it's going to be extreme, to just switch over to Qatar and United States, LNG. There's going to be a significant jump, which we could call a security premium to avoid spending another $1 trillion on managing another Russian-infused crisis. But I think looking at the real numbers, and once you actually break it down, I think that would be a really interesting question to ask today to address that narrative.
I'll just start on the enablers question. For decades, we have been analyzing how this toxic dependence that we have ended up in with Russia has been the result of strategic partnership on the business level between European companies and Russian counterparts. We should be clear that we are over with that, right? This is what we brought, that created the war conditions, So political will should trump industrial desires, The problem is with decision-making in Europe, very often you have a revolving door where a company like Shell is a state within the state, and its strategic business policies determine the strategic policy of the Netherlands, for example. We have that with Total in France, OMV in Austria, sorry. But it's the reality. Enagas in Spain. So yes, but that's why there are political leaders who have long-term strategic consideration to take care of, you know? And on your second question, probably, of course, Isaac has more of the data. Our modeling shows, and it's not, of course, there could be many black swans, you never know. But our expectation is about 10 to 15% increase of the gas price, which is not that much higher than what we have grown to be the usual price, the normal price these days. FITUS 10-page paper at the end of December last year saying that basically Europe would go bankrupt and will fall apart is just, there is no evidence behind it. There is no data-driven analysis. Sorry.
No, you're right. It's a very interesting topic. We've been asked this before. It depends on so many different factors. But yeah, like Martin says, the estimates suggest that between 10 and 15% is a discount offered for relying on Russian gas. But what must be remembered is there is a premium you have to pay on Russian gas that is the volatility. Like we mentioned in the presentation, $900 billion US dollars was the amount the EU paid in energy subsidies to curb this issue created from energy blackmail and the inability to get gas through Nord Stream 2. So just as a case study, I mean, we've seen that the Ukrainian transit ended at the beginning of this year. Gas prices are, I believe, lower than, obviously there's many factors involved there, but gas prices now actually remain lower than for example, pre-winter when gas was flowing through Ukraine. So I think it's very important to also, the final point to take into consideration is that by buying all these Russian fossil fuels, I mean, we've said this before, it's not rocket science, but you're sending so much money to the Kremlin to use to finance its invasion of Ukraine. So therefore, you're making all these payments in aid to Ukraine undermined or less relevant because you're also financing the war machine. And that's why I think it's important to focus on, what would be the financial costs. And, some companies might lose out, some customers might have to pay marginally higher bills, but it's long-term strategic and a sensible investment as well.
Yeah, that actually, I mean, the financing of the war machine, then it sort of it results in all sorts of additional costs for all EU member states.
1 trillion euros.
So I mean, sort of which okay, so there's a marginal price at the pump or whatever, let's say, but there's a rather enormous, there's a huge cost more broadly that people often ignore or just because of the difference in diesel prices or something.
But we're constantly having this discussion, and Olga, you know this. I mean, people react to prices on the ground now. They're not going to react to these arguments. With Gazprom, we've been overpaying. Like Martin's team has done huge calculations in the past. Bulgaria, for example, was overpaying 300 million annually for over 10 years. That's 3 billion, just one country. In Central and Eastern Europe.
Very small.
It's a tremendous amount of money that we've sent over to the Kremlin before the Crimea invasion. Mm-hmm. But people, people will not react to that. But I think that's why we need to develop these investments like the EastMed. Mm-hmm. And that's why I think it's so important that we actually end with this idea that Turk Stream and Nord Stream are actually market projects. If we're thinking about that, we're going to lose that, that competition because it's not going to be market competition, and also producing more, including oil, gas, but also bringing in more renewables online. I think this is the way to keep consumer prices low, and I think we are in a much better position now than we used to be back in 2001 when we had over-relied on Russian gas, and the Russians actually weaponized this in an absurdly an absurd way. That we've let them do that. No more. I think we're going to be real fools if we allow this thing to happen again.
Just one note. There is, instead of just going back to Russia and forget about it and we sleep it all. There are technical ways in which you can stabilize the European gas market so that there are no spikes, and we haven't done our homework. The aggregate demand platform needs to be ramped up and expanded. This ridiculous regulatory condition to store 90+% of your gas consumption in storage facilities, it's really too much. You can actually improve the connectivity of your union. And the energy union is not there, the European Energy Union. So instead of going to the easy solution on paper, we can actually improve how our markets function. And as Ruslan mentioned also, accelerates some of the decarbonization of the industry so that they don't, that these businesses don't rely so much on natural gas, so they're not exposed to this global gas market vulnerability. Europe does not have gas, like the US. So the US gas production has lowered prices so much here, making the US economy so much competitive. Europe could have developed shale gas. Maybe that could be one way forward. But the next best option is try to think what domestically is possible to be done instead of just going back to Russia.
And so just any last sort of suggestions for the Trump administration to consider so the signal effect of even talking about secondary sanctions has had some effects. But what else, mining that seem much more deeply, or what else what might you suggest the Trump administration to consider to start, to bring more pressure to bear on Putin, who seems to be giving a middle finger to the president right now in terms of what he, negotiations to bring this war to an end? Any other suggestions?
No exemptions. They keep providing exemptions for payments to Gazprom Bank. Yeah. This is a big one. So stopping the rollover of that would really prohibit European buyers from continuing to import Russian fossil fuels. Closing the refining loophole we talked about. I personally think, maritime insurance or services ban and sanctioning the entirety of the shadow fleet. Secondary sanctions, of course, on those buyers of Russian fossil fuels too.
I would say also secondary sanctions for the traders. Again, putting my Venezuelan hat. The US policy towards Venezuela in terms of sanctions enforcement, maybe not overall, during the first Trump administration was successful. All the traders, Rosneft controlled Russian traders that were bringing US oil, Venezuelan oil to the world market was sanctioned. It became virtually impossible within several months for Venezuela to keep on selling oil on the world market. Yes, it had other consequences, we all know, but, go after the enablers, go after the guys who actually pocket the profit.
And one of them might be SLB, or the companies as well facilitating Russian oil extraction as well. Sorry.
Well, we're now 10 minutes over, so I'm very conscious of everyone's time. If anybody has any burning question, maybe please have at it. Otherwise, if not, I don't see any hands. All right, I see one lady, ma'am, in the back. One burning question, parting shot.
Zoe Ryder with the National Endowment for Democracy. Really grateful for your work. I'm just curious if if you have been or increasingly facing sort of counterattacks to some of the findings you're putting out there by, public relations firms in Europe or, illicitly funded think tanks, if you're seeing sort of an organized effort to weaken these findings.
Well, I have a slap suit against me. And my father was threatened once, but it's fine.
And the Russians are trying to take us out from many of the international fora, but so far our friends in Europe, Poland in particular, right now the president of the EU has taken care of that, so we're back. But we have to face these challenges off, and we hope that the fact that also the Hudson Institute is welcoming us, is giving us a lot of additional credibility, and we look forward to actually continuing that. I think we've done a lot of good work for the European and the US taxpayers and consumers, and I think we'll continue doing that.
I think lastly, sorry, I respond saying I think there's a lot of disinformation, and that's what our role, we believe, is to go and show and provide the evidence to say this is where you could end reliance on Russian fossil fuels, taking into consideration economic factors where it seems possible, trying to show evidence of that. So there is a lot of disinformation and stuff coming out from entities that want to continue making a lot of profit out of Russian fossil fuels.
Okay, so in that case, why don't we just give a warm round of applause to our panelists, please? Good. Good. And thank you all for coming, and thanks to our online audience, and see you at the next Hudson event.